In the movie Rocky Balboa, Sylvester Stallone had said, "You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done." American slang defines badass as someone who is tough and or intimidating, when in reality, life's greatest badasses are those who are able to take the hits of life's greatest adversities and just keep moving forward. Perhaps moving forward slowly at times, or even taking pauses, but always forward nonetheless. In today's video, I will briefly summarize 3 very famous and different types of men who had each overcome something in a badass kind of way as to be an inspiration to each of us today. These 3 badasses are John D. Rockefeller, Howard Hughes, and Mr. Joseph Merrick, also known as the Elephant Man. But before we begin, please do me a favor and hit the like button, as well as subscribe to my channel in order to hear teachings that you will not find anywhere else. Today's first badass to be summarized is the great John D. Rockefeller. It's common knowledge that by the end of his life, he had created one of the greatest personal fortunes in the history of all mankind, as well as being one of the most generous men who had ever lived. Yet most today are ignorant of the great adversities that John D. Rockefeller had to overcome during the earlier stages of his life, such as being poor, uneducated, as well as having a wayward father who was away from home so often that young Rockefeller was forced to assume the surrogate role of father in order to protect and provide for his mother and siblings. My summary of John D. Rockefeller comes from the outstanding biography entitled Titan by Ron Chernow, being a must-read for anyone who enjoys biographies. John D. Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, to Bill and Eliza Rockefeller. His mother Eliza had a deep-hearted Christian faith which she instilled within her son, while his father was basically a con man and horse thief who stayed away from home for long periods of time, while his wife basically raised their children single-handedly. In fact, his father was such a scumbag that he actually took up a girlfriend and moved her into the family's home with his wife, meaning that his wife and girlfriend both lived in the very same house and gave birth to his children within the very same household. Big Bill, as he was oftentimes called, would leave home for long periods of time and return with large wads of money, whereby the townsfolk nicknamed him Devil Bill due to rampant rumors of his being a gambler, horse thief, and desperado. Along with that, people began to notice that whenever Bill came to their town, that horses began to go missing. During those early years, young John developed his mother's love for the Christian faith, which he leaned on to help him cope with his father's long stints away from home. Or as Ron Chernow had written, John D. Rockefeller was drawn to the church, not as some nagging duty or obligation, but as something deeply refreshing to the soul. The boy saw religion less as a symptom of otherworldly rewards than as a means for moral reformation on earth. "I was trained from the beginning to work and to save," Rockefeller explained. "I've always regarded it as a religious duty to get all I could honorably and to give all I could. I was taught that way by the minister when I was a boy." Then sometime around 1852, his 42-year-old father secretly married a 17-year-old girl in a different city, whereby his father then lived life as a bigamist. Because of that, Big Bill began to groom his eldest son, John, to become the surrogate father of his family in order to care for Eliza during Big Bill's long absences. In essence, young John D. Rockefeller was then forced to become the head of the household in order to protect and provide for the family, simply because his own father wasn't man enough to do it. Because of that, young Rockefeller was forced to go to work, even though jobs were very hard to come by. In his own words, he said, "I was working every day at my business, the business of looking for work. I put in my full time at this every day." He was very persistent in his efforts to find a job, even returning to the same companies 2 or 3 different times to inquire. Then one day he finally found a job at Hewitt and Tuttle, to which he said, "All my future seemed to hinge on that day. and I often tremble when I ask myself the question, what if I had not got the job? He made it his habit to get to work each day around 6:30 a.m. and oftentimes stayed around 10 o'clock each night. Because he was both young and poor, while having to act as a surrogate father to his family, Rockefeller paid 10 cents for a little red book that he called Ledger A so that he could keep track of all of his income and expenditures in order to ensure that he knew where all of his hard-earned money went in order that he never squandered what little money he had. Or as the Bible would say, Rockefeller had taught himself how to seal the financial leaks to his wineskin. Despite his great financial needs, young Rockefeller was mindful to tithe his income each week, as well as to give to the needy as best he could, with Christianity and capitalism forming the twin pillars of his life. In fact, his Christian faith ran so deep that one woman remarked, "In those years, Rockefeller might have been found there, in church, any Sunday, sweeping up the halls, building a fire, lighting the lamps, cleaning the walks, ushering the people to their seats, studying the Bible, praying, singing, performing all the duties of an unselfish and thoroughgoing church member. He was nothing but a clerk and had little money, yet he gave something to every organization in that little old church. He was always very precise about it. If he said that he would give 15 cents, not a living soul could move him to give a penny more or a penny less. He studied his Bible regularly and diligently and knew what was in it." Sometime after which the author wrote, "His last sentence hinted gingerly at what must have been the main reason behind his failure to serve in the Civil War, his father's desertion of the family and his own need to sustain it. Though only 21 at the outbreak of the war, John D. was effectively in the position of a middle-aged father responsible for a family of 6. Therein lies the foundation of John D. Rockefeller's life that very few are aware of, in that he grew up in a poor household with a father who was so wayward and unreliable that young John was forced to become the head of the household by which to help provide for and protect his mother and siblings. Yet despite his great financial needs and other fatherly-like pressures upon him, he never lost sight of his need to remain faithful in tithing, as well as to be charitable to others who were also in need, meaning that his great and unparalleled philanthropic endeavors later in his life were merely an expression of the generosity which he had developed in his youth, and that it simply did not matter whether he was rich or poor, because he was determined to give to others as best he could. And because the early years of his life, in which he provided for and protected his mother and siblings, had been so hard, the author was then able to write of Rockefeller's retirement years. As if he were living his life backward, Rockefeller belatedly entered adolescence in his 9th and 10th decades. It was as if, after all his prenatural exertions, he had attained the one thing denied him, a carefree childhood. The second badass that I would like to summarize is someone that very few, if any, would even consider to be a badass at all, simply because he had been born into wealth and was later widely ridiculed for his many phobias, mental illnesses, chronic pain, and subsequent addiction to his prescription medicine, being Mr. Howard Hughes. All of which leads me to say that I consider Howard Hughes to be a badass simply because no one else seems to appreciate just how much he was able to accomplish in spite of his many phobias, mental illnesses, chronic pain, and addiction to prescription medicine. Because the vast majority of his company's greatest achievements came during the last 26 years of his life while he lived as a recluse to society. Granted, many of his personal mental battles may have kept him bedridden for many long periods of time, yet, despite it all, his companies kept moving forward by which to make many great achievements on his behalf, with one such long-forgotten achievement being the Apache helicopter, which was originally developed by Hughes Helicopters, while Hughes Helicopters was later sold to Boeing. In any event, the greatest turning point of Hughes's life occurred on July 7, 1946, when his XF-11 famously crashed in Beverly Hills, because from that point forward, he lived the last 30 years of his life with chronic pain that culminated into his addiction to prescription medicine. In that crash, Hughes received numerous third-degree burns, a crushed chest with a collapsed left lung, a crushed collarbone, multiple cracked ribs, as well as nerve damage, making it a minor miracle that Hughes even survived the crash at all. On a positive side note, while Hughes recovered in the hospital, he sketched his ideas for a new type of bed that he had his engineers build, being the origins of today's hospital beds. While Hughes proved fortunate enough to survive that crash, he was unfortunate to have to live the remainder of his life with severe chronic pain, as well as subsequent addiction to prescription medicine. Then, some 4 years after his accident, Hughes secluded himself from society and became a total recluse, where he was forced to live in isolation with as many phobias, mental illnesses, chronic pain, and subsequent drug addiction. Yet despite all of those mentally crippling drawbacks, he was still able to run and eventually sell TWA, buy large parts of Las Vegas that in turn helped to transition the mob out of Sin City. Along with that, Hughes Aircraft would progressively make great achievements in such things as radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and even building the first working laser, as well as creating the Surveyor lunar landers in preparation for putting a man on the moon, among many other great things. In fact, Hughes was also the CIA's largest defense contractor as well. It is important to understand that very few people seem to know that Hughes lived the last 30 years of his life with severe chronic pain, which means that it was actually quite remarkable that Hughes was able to live as long as he actually did. But if living for 30 years with chronic pain wasn't hard enough, at the very same time he also lived with as many phobias and mental illnesses, which were all complicated by his addiction to prescription medicine. Now, when taking all of those things into account, it becomes quite obvious that during the last 26 years of his life, when Hughes lived as a recluse to society, that only a very strong-willed and highly intelligent person could cope with such great obstacles over such a long period of time. Because few with severe chronic pain have ever lived as long as he did. Few with many phobias and mental illnesses have ever lived as long as he did. Few with drug dependency issues have ever lived as long as he did. Few have ever achieved anything as great or had as many achievements as he did. And if all that wasn't enough, he dealt with each of those issues all at the very same time, which to me more than justifies his badass label. Of course, there are many other great men and women who have taught themselves how to overcome some type of great adversity, and for further study you might want to consider reading The First Tycoon by T.J. Stiles, which reveals Cornelius Vanderbilt's efforts to overcome his state of being both poor and uneducated, Changing How the World Does Business by Roger Frock, which reveals Fred Smith's efforts to overcome the nearly impossible odds by which to make FedEx a success, as do the many biographies of Henry Ford that detail his rise from his 2 prior bankruptcies before finally being able to make Ford successful. On an interesting side note, Henry Ford's first bankrupted venture wasn't a total loss, as the remnants of his first failed venture is now called Cadillac. All of which now brings us to who I believe to be the biggest badass who ever lived, Mr. Joseph Merrick, also known as the Elephant Man, who epitomized those words of Mr. Sylvester Stallone, which I must now repeat because no one is more deserving of these words than Mr. Merrick. You, me, or nobody is going to hit as hard as life, but it ain't about how hard you hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward, how much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. Mindful of that statement, there is a fruit of the Spirit called long-suffering, which most Christians wrongly associate to being the ability to suffer over a long period of time, when in reality, long-suffering is the antithesis of revenge, as long-suffering is what empowers us to maintain our composure and self-discipline as we endure hardships without becoming a spiritual reservoir of bitterness and vengeance. Or in other words, to take life's hits while we keep moving forward, constantly moving forward. In the book entitled Measured by the Soul, The Life of Joseph Carey Merrick by Jeanette Sitton and May Siwa Strochan, we learn that Mr. Joseph Merrick was born on August 5, 1862, to Joseph and Mary Jane Merrick. At first, Joseph appeared to be a perfectly healthy baby until around 20 months old when he developed his first tumor, being a swelling to the right of his upper lip. Then at age 5, Joseph suffered a bad fall that caused his left hip to become so infected that he was forced to walk with a cane for the remainder of his life. Along with that, bony lumps had also begun to grow on his forehead, as did his spine develop a corkscrew-like bend by which to worsen his limp. Because of his deformities and need of a cane, had he been bullied or teased by any of his classmates, he would have been utterly unable to fight back or run away, having no choice but to stand and endure. Fortunately for him, during that time his mother, Mary Jane, had a strong Christian faith and instilled within her son both a deep love for books and Christianity, both of which he retained throughout his lifetime. Unfortunately, his time with his mother was short because the greatest tragedy in his life occurred when he was just 11 years old, being the untimely death of his mother from bronchial pneumonia, as she also happened to be his sole source of emotional and spiritual support, after which young Joseph's life exponentially worsened. His father proved to be an emotionally and physically abusive man who pulled young Joseph out of school and forced him to go to work to try to earn money for the family, which young Joseph really wasn't able to do because there were few jobs available at the time, not to mention the fact that his physical deformities made it quite difficult for him to find anyone who would be willing to hire him. In time, Joseph was eventually able to find work rolling cigars at a local cigar factory, which lasted for about 2 years, being when the growing deformities to his right hand prevented him from actually being able to roll cigars. His father, who happened to have a small haberdashery, then forced young Joseph to sell his men's accessories products as he walked the streets, even making him go door to door. As anyone could easily imagine, most who opened their doors to Joseph were immediately frightened by his deformities, which in turn hindered his ability to sell. Even worse, it was not uncommon for a group of schoolchildren to follow and taunt him as he tried, with evidently few, if any, adults in his hometown forcing those taunting children to shut up. And if all that wasn't bad enough, each day his father gave him a sales quota that he had to meet, and if Joseph failed to meet his sales quota, his father oftentimes either beat him or deprived him of his supper. As time progressed, the tumor in his mouth continued to grow and in turn hampered his speech. Plus, his disease caused his head to swell until it was nearly the size of his waist, as did warty flaps of skin hang from his back and chest. In his autobiography, Joseph tells us that he would stay out the whole day with a hungry stomach rather than face beatings at home. Then one day his father beat him so severely that Joseph ran away from home for good, and his father never bothered to look for him, meaning that on the one hand he was finally free, while on the other hand being homeless, penniless, friendless, and nearly unemployable. Fortunately, his uncle found him and let him stay with them for the next 2 years, during which time his physical deformities worsened, as did the unpleasant body aroma that was now admitted, through which he simply was not able to find any work at all. After 2 years, his uncle's growing family could no longer support him, so Joseph was then forced to live at the Lancaster Union Workhouse, where he would be forced to live and work under horrendous conditions for the next 4 years, during which time he was forced to have an 8-inch growth that hung from his upper lip surgically removed, which in the 1880s had to be an extremely painful procedure. Then in 1884 he found work in the traveling freak show circus, whereby he famously became known as the Elephant Man. However, in stark contrast to the movie, the freak show proprietor and managers all treated him with respect and even kindness. They paid all his expenses and split their earnings with him 50-50. He was also allowed to keep the profit from the sales of the pamphlet based on Tom Norman's memoir. It was during this time that Joseph had begun to wear a hood and cap so that he could walk around without frightening other people. Anyway, within 2 years, Joseph had saved 50 pounds, being close to $6,300 in today's American rates, which someone then stole from him and forced him to once again live as penniless. One man wrote of Joseph, "He was a man of very strong character and beliefs, anxious to earn his own living and be independent of charity." Best of all, unlike many who have no problem standing on a street corner panhandling for money, when it came to passing the hat, which was the term for begging for money at that time, Joseph found this as an affront to his dignity. He turned to Tom at once and said, "We are not beggars, are we, Thomas?" Fortunately, it was during this time when Frederick Trees visited the freak show and met Mr. Merrick, though Joseph would not come to live at the Royal London Hospital for another 2 years. During his early months at the hospital, Trees observed that Merrick's sole idea of happiness was to creep into the darkness and hide. He disliked being handled and bathed by the nurses, and trembled with fear when unexpected visitors opened the door. Treves suspected that Joseph fell in love with every attractive woman he met and pictured himself the hero of many a passionate incident. Then one day Joseph broke down and wept uncontrollably. It was the very first time that he had ever shaken hands with a woman. During his time living at the hospital, his fame in the papers had also become widely known to the point that everybody wanted to see him. He must have been visited by almost every lady of note in the social world. They were all good enough to welcome him with a smile and to shake hands with him. Then Merrick, whom I had found shivering behind a rag of a curtain in an empty shop, was now conversant with duchesses and countesses and other ladies of high degree. Above all, he lost his shyness. He liked to see his door pushed open and for people to look in. Or in other words, Joseph Merrick worked out his own salvation with fear and trembling. Because of his many deformities and greatly enlarged swollen head, Joseph Merrick had a lifelong need to sleep sitting upright with his head rested upon his knees, night after night after night, which had to be an extremely uncomfortable position to sleep in. Finally, on April 11, 1890, Joseph Merrick was found dead in bed, having laid on his back to sleep, as opposed to sleeping upright with his head upon his knees as had been his custom. Or as Treves had noted, he often said to me that he wished he could lie down to sleep like other people. Thus it came about that his death was due to the desire that had dominated his life, the pathetic but hopeless desire to be like other people. All of which leads me to state that, in my opinion, Mr. Joseph Merrick, also known as the Elephant Man, is the biggest badass who ever lived. But what made him such a badass wasn't the fact that he had to live his entire life with an incurable disease of hideous physical deformities and offensive body odor that forced him to live as an outcast to society, where at times he was either homeless, friendless, penniless, unemployable, and utterly powerless to change any of it. But rather, I believe Mr. Joseph Merrick to be the biggest badass who ever lived, simply because he never ran from his plight through the use of drugs, alcohol, panhandling, theft, vengeance, nor suicide. But rather he just kept taking the hits of life, every single hit, every second of his life, and just kept moving forward. More often than not, moving slowly forward, and often times alone with no particular direction of mind, but moving forward nonetheless, having never degraded himself into becoming either a junkie, drunkard, nor beggar. He was truly a badass of long suffering that every single junkie, drunk, beggar, and criminal should cower in shame of. All of which begs the question, where was the church during his years of need?